Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this Torchlight AI webinar. Today we will be discussing what's next for Russia following the Wagner Group's mutiny on 24th June and the geopolitical impact. My name is Judith Jacob and I am the Deputy Director of Geopolitical Intelligence here at Torchlight. I'm very pleased to be chairing this event. Here are a few housekeeping points up on the screen. I'm sure none of this is new, but the main things to note are that we will be recording the webinar and everyone who has registered will receive a copy. Secondly, you can submit questions anonymously through the chat function throughout the presentation, and we will address them at the end. We've already received some very good questions that our speakers are looking forward to answering. I would encourage you to submit more as we go along. If there are any questions that you would like to ask privately or come to you after the conclusion of the presentation, we also welcome you to email us. Our contact details will be provided at the end of the presentation. I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Firstly, we have Tim Bristow, who is our head of the former Soviet Union countries. Tim joined us at the start of the year after a 20-year career in government in intelligence. He was deployed twice to Afghanistan in support of NATO military operations there, and at Torchlight, he produces high-quality reports for our clients. He also holds a Master's in International Policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Secondly, we have Andrew Smith. Andrew was appointed as Torchlight's head of Africa in May 2022, and he spent 2 years prior to that embedded with a telecommunications firm. Prior to joining Torchlight, Andrew held several positions at other political risk consultancies, think tanks, where he almost focused exclusively on politics, security, and economic issues in sub-Saharan Africa. Andrew also holds a MA in Conflict, Security, and Development from King's College London. Finally, we have our lead East Asia analyst, Cyrus Yao. Cyrus has extensive experience providing analytical insights on geopolitical and domestic policy from multinational businesses and industry associations in the Asia-Pacific region. He holds a degree from the Chinese University of Hong Kong with specializations in international relations and public administration. So before I let our panelists get on with their discussion, I'm going to do some scene setting here first. On the 23rd of June, I'm sure as you all know, Yevgeny Prigozhin released a provocative video rejecting President Vladimir Putin's justifications for the invasion of Ukraine. The video is a significant escalation from a long-running feud between Prigozhin and the Defense Ministry, which Tim will explore later in this discussion. Prigozhin also releases several audio recordings on Telegram calling the Russian military leadership evil and that they must be stopped. He then says his Wagner military forces will march for justice against the Russian military. The following day, on the 24th of June, Prigozhin announces that his men have crossed the border from Ukraine into Russia. By 7:30 a.m., about 5,000 Wagner Group forces have entered the city of Rostov-on-Don in the south of Russia, taking control of the army headquarters there. Prigozhin claims that he has the support of local people as well. The group then begins a march towards Moscow about 2 hours later. In response, Putin makes a television address calling the events an armed mutiny and accuses Prigozhin of treason. Russian troops also set up barricades in the outskirts of Moscow in preparation for the advance. However, by 8 p.m. that evening, Prigozhin orders a halt to the march just 200 kilometers from the city limits. Prigozhin claims that he wants to avoid shedding Russian blood, and it later transpires that Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has brokered a deal between Putin and Prigozhin, where the latter would relocate to Brussels along with his forces to avoid persecution. I'm now going to hand over to Tim to talk about the consequences of those events.
Thanks so much, Judith. As mentioned, the day before all of this all transpired, we have some serious escalation in Prigozhin's rhetoric. He has been very well known for quite a long time in criticizing the Russian military, and how it's been handling the war. And in many ways, he could have been justified in this because obviously Wagner has had some successes, which much of the regular military has not. One of the things that he did criticize was the actual motives of the leadership within the defense ministry and within the military. While they sit behind their luxury desks, these guys are all dying in Ukraine. And at that point, it is entirely possible that this was a red line that he crossed, and it was evident, and I think most of us observers had been saying for quite a while, that he has really been pushing the boundaries so far. However, slightly before this, Shoigu, defense minister, came out with an official writ which was to subjugate all private military companies, PMCs, to the defense ministry itself. In other words, taking orders directly from the defense ministry, which hitherto they had not been doing. One of the reasons why Wagner may have been more successful than much of the regular military is because it did in fact have this kind of freedom to act outside of the defense ministry's writ. Shoigu's writ essentially subjugated all of the PMCs to being underneath the military rule, under Gerasimov's rule. Now, Prigozhin was not happy about this and was very vocal about it. The video that was sent out is probably a response to this writ. At this point, I believe that Prigozhin probably felt that he had some support within the defense ministry and also certainly within Wagner itself. When he marched out of Ukraine and into Russia, he had no resistance on the border from the border guards. And he pretty much marched straight into Rostov-on-Don, the southern military district headquarters, which you would think would be an extremely well-defended area. He virtually walked in there unopposed. His march 2 hours later got up as far as 200 kilometers from the city limits of Moscow. The official reason, obviously as stated, was that he wanted to avoid bloodshed. And that is entirely possible it could have been his own bloodshed, since he probably did not have enough people in his convoy to actually take the city with the amount that he had. But he also most likely felt that there was some kind of support that was going to be generated from the defense ministry and from the regular military itself. There is almost no doubt in my mind that he thought that he was going to get some support and that there would be other people falling in with him to remove Shoigu and Gerasimov from their positions. When that did not materialize, he was forced to stop. In the aftermath of this, of course, we hear the Kremlin saying that Wagner has been dissolved and that it no longer exists, even if it had ever done so. Wagner has always, of course, been quite a contentious organization, and in many ways that was one of the reasons why it has been so successful in places like Africa, for example. But the official line from the Kremlin is now that Wagner has been dissolved and that it now no longer exists. Putin automatically went after all of Prigozhin's activities in Moscow and various other areas, including various different areas of Concord, which was his franchise, and has actively tried to ridicule him on TV and in social media with the wigs and the various different things like this that we have seen recently. Lukashenko, of course, has come out on this looking quite good because he now looks like he is an international mediator. He gets to have a force of very well-trained, battle-hardened mercenaries at his disposal in Minsk at a potential training camp. However, one of the other things that had happened soon after Prigozhin's backtrack was that Wagner had to give over most of its equipment, including pretty much all, as far as I can tell, of its heavy equipment, which it would have needed if it were to continue in Ukraine and which it would need elsewhere. So now what we have is a very lightly armed force, regardless of where it is located. In the aftermath of all of this, the Kremlin has also, I believe that we can now safely say that it is engaging in a purge of some of the staff and some of the senior leadership within both the defense ministry and in the military itself. We definitely know that we have not heard from Gerasimov, the actual commander, the chief of general staff, for quite a few weeks now, and he has kind of disappeared soon after the Prigozhin uprising. The second in command in Ukraine, General Surovikin, was a known sympathizer of Wagner, known sympathizer of Prigozhin, but he also appears to have been either arrested or has certainly disappeared. Today I've seen some reports that he's actually been arrested and been relieved of his duties. However, I've also seen several reports of many senior leaders within the military and potentially within the defense ministry also having been arrested or at least have disappeared. They have obviously been very coy about the amount of information that is being given out on this, but I've seen up to and including 13 to 18 members of the Russian military have been sidelined by the Kremlin for their potential support of Prigozhin's uprising. Change the slide, please. What obviously we can see from this event is it has called into a great deal of question how stable the Putin regime actually is. The fact that this even happened under Putin's regime is surprising in and of itself, and it's obviously spellbound all of us in the last few weeks as just watching how this all unfurls. Putin is in a difficult position because Prigozhin has been an ally of his for many, many years. He has in fact been one of the very close members. People have actually mentioned that Prigozhin could have been in his inner circle. I'm not entirely certain I like that idea myself, but at the same time, he has obviously been very, very close and a very dependable servant of the Kremlin for many years. Backtracking on Prigozhin signals that the Kremlin is in a very difficult position. By acting against Prigozhin, he is risking cutting off a very effective military force in Ukraine. And also, he's admitting the systemic failures of the regular military, which, of course, Prigozhin has been highlighting for many months. Prigozhin has been a mouthpiece for many pro-war views, and these are the kinds of pro-Kremlin social media and other kinds of far-right types that the Kremlin has depended upon for its support in the war. Prigozhin has been pretty much the first among equals on this score, and he has also got a lot of credibility because he's been out there in the front lines. So a lot of the members of the far-right pro-Kremlin group are rightfully probably a little annoyed by the fact that Prigozhin has been sidelined like this. Moreover, he's quite popular in his own right, as mentioned by Judith earlier. He said that he had support in Rostov-on-Don, and in fact there are many pictures of locals flocking around his convoy as it left. The Levada Center has had a poll in which Prigozhin has been a very popular member of the Russian, a very popular person, almost equal to Sergei Shoigu and Putin himself. However, this also then kind of transpires into how popular is he, and if he were to be sidelined, how much political kickback would that give to the Kremlin? At the same time, by allowing Prigozhin to remain in place, or at least allowing Wagner to remain in place, the Kremlin is signaling that it is not in control, and it's not able to give the same sort of strong response that Putin has shown that he is supposedly famous for. This is his narrative. He is a strong man. Moreover, if you try to prosecute Prigozhin, if you do not prosecute Prigozhin for his quite obviously treacherous statements and the fact that he is actually physically saying to everybody, we do not agree with how this war is being run, how do you justify at the same time arresting an average Russian who is just wearing blue and yellow, tacitly supporting Ukraine and undermining the troops? These people get 5 years in prison, up to 20 years in prison, for criticizing the war. Prigozhin is able to get away with it. Obviously, that's a juxtaposition, and it's obviously a difficult one for the Kremlin to come to terms with. And nobody is going to be blind to seeing this juxtaposition. Kremlin propaganda, on the other hand, has tried to maintain that everything is as usual. There has been no change. This was merely a slip, and that it's all been dealt with. And the social media, the official media, the press have all been continually saying, of course, that the war is continually going as planned, and that they are still winning beyond everybody's wildest dreams. Wagner has been tried. There has been a conscious attempt by the Kremlin to separate Wagner from the leadership of Wagner. In other words, Prigozhin is deemed as the bad guy in all of this, whereas the Wagner fighters themselves are all good people, and they are war heroes, essentially. However, what we are seeing here, and I think that this is what is coming out most vociferously when we look deeper into how the Kremlin is dealing with all of this, is that the Russian power structure appears to have no ability to push back against bad and unpopular decisions. What we can see here is that if there are problems turning up for the Kremlin to deal with, it has a very strong problem with its power vertical. People are unwilling to say no. People are unwilling to act. People are unwilling to take responsibility. And this only pushes the responsibility further and further towards the top. In other words, the Kremlin is always able to find new solutions, new challenges, new problems. But it's finding it very, very difficult to address the ways to deal with actual problems that are actually occurring and finding solutions to them. Change the slide, please. So what has happened to Wagner after the rebellion? What we can see, and admittedly this picture is now still becoming gradually framed. There's more information coming out on this every single day. We have heard that Wagner will not be being used in Ukraine. However, there is also a possibility that Wagner leaders or Wagner members will sign up to be underneath the Russian military and will go back into Ukraine. However, we do not know who the commander will be. There is a possibility, as far as the Kremlin or Defense Ministry have announced, a man called Sedoy, General Sedoy, who has been in Wagner for a little while now, and it's possible that he may take over the group. Whether he has the same sort of support as Prigozhin did still remains to be seen, and I am somewhat doubtful that an official member of the Russian military is going to actually be listened to in the same sort of way as the firebrand Prigozhin. With all of the weapons that have been handed in for obvious reasons now, Wagner does not have its heavy weaponry, and therefore it's debatable how effective it would be in Ukraine and how effective it will be elsewhere. This is arguably probably does not affect its operations in Africa, which later on Andrew will go through. But the capabilities that it does have now are obviously significantly less. He does have battle-hardened troops. They still have light weapons, but they do not have tanks, and they do not have much of their heavy weaponry that they were using before, which would make them a very effective force. In Belarus, we are starting to see a lot of the former Wagner members, or at least that's what we're assuming, turning up at this base that Lukashenko has created in Osipechka. Is about 100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. It is ostensibly being used as a training camp for Belarus soldiers. However, having a large number of mercenary members who are armed this close to both the Ukrainian and the NATO borders of Lithuania, Poland, make this a very uncomfortable position for these guys to be. There have been rumors that they might open a second front from there. I believe that this is not going to happen at this particular minute specifically because they do not have the heavy weapons in order to do that, but also the Ukrainian front area of the Ukrainian border with Belarus is extremely heavily defended by Ukrainians, and it is going to take a lot more than that small force of Wagnerites to take that area. There's also been, of course, talk that this is going to be a training camp for Belarus soldiers, which I think is more likely. A slightly more out there theory also holds that this small force is also going to be used to take out to start to occupy the Suwałki corridor in Poland, Lithuania, which is the little corridor that connects Kaliningrad with Belarus. However, doing this, regardless of whether it's a mercenary force or not, would probably trigger NATO's Article 5 and is therefore, in my opinion, quite unlikely to happen. Prigozhin, regardless of what his whereabouts now, and we really do not know exactly where he is, and he's been very, very quiet recently, which is unusual because he is usually extremely vociferous on social media. He remains a very popular person amongst the far-right military bloggers and the pro-Kremlin types and amongst social media. So he is still popular regardless of whether he's been arrested. In fact, potentially because he's been sidelined, might even be making him even more popular, certainly making him a lot more knowable. In order to understand how Wagner is going to act elsewhere, I'm going to pass this over to Andrew Smith, who is going to talk about Africa, the Wagner's operations in Africa. Andrew, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So I think it's probably worth just spending a few minutes just kind of talking about what we mean when we mention Wagner in Africa. What does it look like? Where is it active? What is it doing? What services is it providing? So Wagner in Africa is more of a catch-all term, a phrase. It's actually an expansive network of companies with the group operating under several different entities in several different countries, and these entities often depend on the services they provide. So as you can see on the map I've put there, for example, in Sudan, they're called Mero Gold, heavily involved in the gold sector, as you would expect. In the Central African Republic, they're called Siwa, Mineral Resources, Dianville, and various others. And then in Mali, they're called Prime Security. Some of these, and again, these are also just the ones that we actually know about. And this is mainly because some of these have actually been sanctioned by the US and the EU since the beginning of the year. And actually, I think 4 of them were sanctioned about 2 or 3 weeks ago as well. So at present, and I've just alluded to them, Wagner is confirmed, so we've kind of got hard evidence that it's active in at least 3 sub-Saharan African countries. Its presence is most notable in the Central African Republic and Mali, where it's heavily involved in combat operations, as well as the close protection for executives, including the president in the case of the CAR. In both of these cases, it provides its services in order to access natural resources, including minerals and timber, and also, particularly in the Central Republic, to advance its commercial interests in several other sectors as well. It's also active in Sudan, which has obviously received a lot more attention in recent months because of the ongoing conflict there, where it's providing support to both sides of the conflict. So it's providing kind of logistics and arms to the paramilitary rapid support forces, and it's also previously provided training to the Sudanese army. Again, this has all been in return for access to gold mines in the north of Sudan. Unlike Mali and the Central Republic, it doesn't have combat troops, or at least what we don't know, it doesn't have combat troops on the ground in Sudan. The other African country where it has a large presence supporting the forces of General Haftar is in Libya, but I'm not going to go too much into that. Wagner is also believed to have some links in Cameroon, and the reason I've not flagged it on the map is because this appears more to be for kind of import and export purposes in terms of getting supplies and equipment in and out, and it's not actively been offering its services there as it has been in the 3 other countries. There also remains quite limited evidence that the group is active in Burkina Faso and the DRC, which have been linked with Wagner in the past kind of 6 months, particularly in Burkina Faso. At least pre-Mutiny, Both were likely Wagner targets, as they contain many of the conditions that Wagner has exploited in Mali and CAR. They're resource rich, they're got areas of high insecurity, they're poorly governed, and there's growing anti-Western sentiment in both of them. And there's been reports that there was at least preliminary talks held between senior Wagner members and senior political leaders in these countries. But again, how this progresses now after the mutiny is really up for question. It's also worth mentioning that Wagner is no longer active in Mozambique. It was temporarily deployed there in 2019 to combat the insurgency that's ongoing in the north of the country. However, they withdrew within a matter of months. So a bit more on Wagner's services and what it offers. It offers, through its various entities, it offers a range of military, political, and economic services. Kind of on the military and on the security side, it offers everything from the training of local forces and arms and equipment supplies to close protection, site security, and as I mentioned, all the way up to full combat operations. On the political side, it's kind of mostly been involved in propaganda and disinformation campaigns across the continent. Most of these have been aimed at kind of increasing anti-Western and pro-Russian sentiment in Africa, but it's also provided things such as kind of election manipulation. It's also previously provided strategic advice to governments. So kind of one of its first moves in Africa was actually providing advice to the former leadership of Sudan under President Omar al-Bashir of how to put down the protests that erupted there in 2019 and ultimately led to Bashir's ousting. On the economic side, it is involved in natural resource extraction, particularly of gold, diamonds, and timber, and it's also involved in activities such as smuggling as well. So that's kind of a broad overview of what Wagner is doing and where it is active. So since the Wagner mutiny in Russia, have we seen any particular impact on Wagner's operations in Africa to date? Well, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov came out very quickly after the coup, I think in about 2 or 3 days, and said that Wagner's operations across Africa would be unaffected. And this is partly because the likes of Central African Republic and Mali have contracts with Moscow directly, and this kind of assures some degree of continuity there. But he also said that it was really down to the individual African governments to decide if they wanted to continue using Wagner services. And since this comment, the only real kind of hard evidence we have of another development has been in the Central African Republic, where about 2 weeks ago now, around 400 to 600 Wagner troops kind of suddenly withdrew, vacated the bases. The reasons aren't entirely clear why that has happened, and several dozen have actually been redeployed back to the CAR in the last couple of days. I think it was Sunday or Monday this week. But the number of these that have been redeployed is still considerably less than those that have left. It's also worth mentioning that Wagner's post-mutiny kind of recruitment efforts, which obviously it said it wasn't going to do, also appear to be targeting its African operations. So they're listing things such as it's essential that you have Arabic or French language skills. So they're really the main things that we have seen come out since the mutiny. How are things going to develop in terms of Wagner's operations in Africa in the coming months, over the rest of this year? And I think this is really going to depend on what happens with the Kremlin's efforts to take greater control of Wagner entities both in Russia and in Africa. As Tim said, Moscow is actively breaking up the Wagner empire, so it seems quite likely that some of Wagner's companies in Africa are going to be dissolved. Some are going to be kind of merged within or taken control of by Russian state institutions or the military, or they're going to be kind of merged and taken over by oligarchs and their companies, and oligarchs that remain close to Putin. When this happens, I think a lot is then going to depend on the loyalty of Wagner troops in Africa to Prigozhin himself. Are they going to accept being asked to sign contracts with the Russian military, or being put under the leadership of some kind of new oligarch that they don't really know and doesn't really have any kind of direct combat experience? I mean, it's likely to be somewhere probably in the middle of how that goes. There's also going to be then questions over, will the Kremlin still pay them well? Or is this going to risk kind of fomenting discontent within the former military? Or, what are Russian troops on the front line in Ukraine going to think when they see these guys in Mali and the Central Republic still being paid relatively well, despite being kind of formally part of the kind of same institution? Some reports did come out last week, however, that part of the deal between Putin and Prigozhin that to end the Wagner mutiny is going to allow Wagner, under Prigozhin's leader, to keep some of its entities in Africa. And this seems that it's mostly going to apply in the Central African Republic, where Wagner is most entrenched, and it has commercial interests outside of the normal services that it provides. So given all of this, what I've just kind of discussed, it does seem likely that Wagner, in one form or another, whether it be under new leadership, under the kind of new entity names, etc., is going to continue to provide its services to African countries in the years ahead. It's likely that, as this kind of transition phase, if you want to call it that, is ongoing, there's going to be some kind of temporary disruption, and it's certainly probably going to affect its expansion plans into places like Burkina Faso and the DRC. But overall, in the long term, I think its services will largely be unaffected. And this really speaks to the fact that Wagner has spearheaded Russian foreign policy in Africa over the past 5 or 6 years. And it's unlikely that kind of Moscow is going to be willing to kind of rip this up root and stem and kind of start again, because it's going to undermine all this progress it has made, particularly in terms of countering Western influence and things like that in kind of former French colonies. All of that said, the one Wagner activity that there seems to be a bit more certainty around in terms of kind of its future continuities around its propaganda and disinformation campaigns. This is where several Prigozhin companies have developed serious expertise and an array of digital services, which I've already kind of touched upon: election manipulation tactics, social media disinformation campaigns, things like that. And that sort of stuff that Kremlin would find very, very difficult to reproduce at such a scale in a short space of time. So it's unlikely that there's going to be any major disruption in the space, bar maybe a change in leadership of those entities. So that kind of brings us on to the final point that I'm going to speak about, and how is the Wagner immunity going to impact Russia and the Kremlin's foreign policy objectives in Africa more broadly? Is the mutiny also going to impact the way that African countries perceive or engage with a Putin-led Russia? I think a lot of this is actually going to come out in the next week or so. So on the 27th to 28th of July, so next Thursday, next Friday, the second Russian-Africa summit is due to be held in St. Petersburg. This is going to provide a lot more insight on how Moscow is going to engage with African countries moving forwards, as well as how African countries are going to engage with Russia. And despite the summit, like I said, just been over a week away, there's still no clear idea of how many African leaders are planning to attend the discussion, to attend the summit, what the main discussion points are going to be, what is the agenda. And it's quite likely that Russia's decision on Monday to pull out of the Black Sea grain deal could actually overshadow this summit entirely. And it's fairly safe to say that there's been a lot less hype around this summit than there was around the first one, which was held in Sochi in 2019. Having said all of that, Wagner mutiny seems unlikely it's going to affect Russian foreign policy too much moving forwards, especially if the Wagner entities are kind of merged under other Russian state institutions in the military, taken over by other kind of Putin-linked entities, and it will continue to provide its services in one form or another. It's also probably worth noting that over the past couple of years, and in particular since the start of the Ukraine conflict, Russia has been trying to strengthen its position across Africa, separate from Wagner's activities. So Lavrov has been on multiple African tours in the past 6 months and in the past year, including to some of Africa's kind of big powers, including South Africa and Kenya. And several agreements on things like military cooperation have been secured. So it seems most like, if anything, Russia's going to double down on this engagement and really try and reassert its reputation as a stable and reliable security partner for African countries, which is arguably kind of that reputation is what has been dented the most after the Wagner rebellion. So I think at the summit next week, that is probably what you're going to see reflected, and it's unlikely that we're going to see anything more substantial than more military deals. You're not going to see significant investment pledges or commitments to energy cooperation and things like that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Cyrus, who's going to discuss how the Wagner mutiny is going to impact Russia-China relations moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So I'm now going to begin by outlining how we see the partnership between Russia and China in the future, as well as China's official stance on Ukraine following the rebellion. Overall, we assess that Beijing will exercise more caution in handling issues involving the Ukraine conflict, but there will be no major shifts on its relationship with Moscow over the coming months. We understand that the ongoing conflicts are creating economic hardship for China. For example, weakening Western demand and also increasing reputational risks and also sanction risks of doing business with Russian entities. However, we expect that the situation would be worse if there were sudden leadership changes in Moscow. Actually, the fundamental interest of Beijing, and especially President Xi Jinping, is to ensure that there will be a smooth functioning of the Russian government and also the market. Because we know that stabilizing economic recovery remains Beijing's primary objective for this year. As we can see from the graph below, the trade value between China and Russia has been increasing over the past few years. Indeed, the overall trade between China and Russia rose by nearly 30% last year, and we can see that Russia has become a top destination for Chinese smartphones and also other electronic products since the Ukraine conflict started. Apart from the economic benefits of being a solid partner of Russia, the continuation of Putin's political power, as well as his military operation against Ukraine, will help shift the Western focus from Indo-Pacific to Eastern Europe. This will indeed help achieve Xi Jinping's long-term political goals to claim sovereignty in Taiwan and also the South China Sea. The ongoing conflicts will provide a great opportunity for China to continue to project and expand its military influence in Asia. Not to mention that the Chinese army has actually been using Russia's military operation as a reference of its future unification plan for Taiwan. Therefore, Xi Jinping's leadership and his long-standing efforts to unify the island will be undermined if Putin fails to properly handle the Wagner Mutiny and restore his leadership. Therefore, Xi Jinping is unlikely to withdraw his support for Putin in the near term. Also, we can see that Putin actually attended the recent Beijing-led SCO summit in the start of July. It actually reflects his intention to demonstrate his leadership in front of the Chinese government. This was his first public appearance on the international stage after the rebellion, and his attendance alongside Xi Jinping will help him convince Beijing that he is still able to maintain his power. If not, Beijing may gradually adjust its foreign policy as well as the so-called no-limits partnership with Moscow. Such a major shift in their bilateral relationships will pose great impacts on the geopolitical and also business environment. We have therefore listed out 3 key indicators that may help us to assess whether there will be potential changes of their partnerships in the future. The first one will be economic interdependence between the both countries. As we mentioned before, the two countries have been doing a lot of trading business since the conflict started. Beijing will be particularly keen to import more cheap energies or fossil fuels from Moscow in the future. Therefore, we expect that China will hope to secure a more stable supply of oil and gas, and in turn to keep its momentum of boosting economic and manufacturing activities. However, if China starts to actively sourcing new energy partners or try to diversify its trade partners in the future, it may somehow mean that China is no longer having the same level of confidence in Russia as it did before, and it may signals that China is actually trying to reduce its reliance on Russia and try to shift its foreign policy stance. The second one will be the diplomatic language shown on China's official statement or press release. The Chinese government actually often indicates its official stance on political issues by carefully choosing different kinds of diplomatic slogans or wording. Last month, the Chinese ambassador to the EU has said that it does not rule out Beijing's support for Ukraine's desire to restore its territorial integrity. Of course, it is just a minor comment made by a middle-level officials from China. But if the central government or the foreign ministry suddenly release a similar statement, or a Chinese official with a higher rank made similar statement in the future, it may actually signal that Beijing is shifting, or at least considering to shift its official stance on the conflict and the Russia partnership in the future. Last but not least, we all know that there has been very strict domestic media control and internet censorship program in China. Comments on global issues like the Ukraine conflict are actually strictly monitored by the state agencies. For example, at the beginning of the conflict, most of the state media outlets actually report the conflict with a positive tone, while comments on social media that support Ukraine are often censored by the state agencies. The similar situation happened again last month after Wagner's rebellion. The event was not covered extensively by Chinese media, which aligns with Beijing's official stance, which described the matter as Russia's internal affairs. Hence, we expect that if the authorities suddenly ease its internet control on discussion about Ukraine and Russia, for example, allowing Chinese media and internet users to support Ukraine's counterattack or even criticize Putin's leadership, it may somehow indicate that China is losing its confidence in Russia and also trying to address its so-called no-limits partnership. Nonetheless, we have not seen any key sign that the above three indicators are going to materialize in the near future, and hence we are going to maintain our prediction that there will be no major shift in the China-Russia relationship at this stage. So now we are going to have the Q&A sessions.
Thank you so much to our presenters for such a comprehensive overview of the situation. We have a couple of questions that have come in already. The first one is for Tim, actually. Could you speak a little bit more about how the Ukraine war will look without Wagner's involvement?
That's a difficult one because at this current time, we are not certain whether the Kremlin is kind of allowing Wagner forces to go back in under a different commander, and whether they're going to resupply them with heavy weapons. For obvious reasons, the Wagner Group has been very prominent because it was relatively successful. And when I say relatively successful, I think what we have to juxtapose this with and put it into relative terms is that the Russian military itself was not very successful. And therefore, any successes that did happen were obviously elevated, and most of those successes came under Wagner in Bakhmut, Vuhledar, and various other areas like that. At the same time, Wagner's abilities in those areas, while they managed to sustain operations, we continually saw Bakhmut has been taken, and then find out that it was not. So in some ways, it's a possibility that much of the Wagner successes were a little bit of hype, although there is no doubt that they were much more efficient than the regular forces. Bringing them back into the conflict would obviously make sense from the Russian point of view. However, how risky is that if these guys are half of their force and if this sort of thing happens again? Obviously, they're not going to be going in under Prigozhin, and therefore it's a question of how many people would go into Ukraine under a different commander, this new commander, Sadoy, for example. It's a difficult question to answer because I personally think that now Wagner has been completely stripped of most of its abilities. The only abilities that it has, and they are very important abilities, are the fact that they have very experienced troops, and they've been in this position before. It would make sense to send them back in, and if they did, they would be underneath the Russian military, and the Russian military command structure, as we have seen, is not particularly great. So I do not think that Wagner would make a particularly big difference if they were to send them in the current format that I am hearing, i.e. underneath the Russian military. Most of the Wagner successes came because they were able to operate outside of the Russian military command structure. And I don't think that they're going to be allowed to do that. So therefore, I think the amount of, the long story short is I think it would be negligible at this particular minute, unless they were to be allowed to be independent again.
Great. Thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. Andrew, there is a question for you here. Could you speak a little bit more about the direct stability and security implications for Wagner's restructure in Africa?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think a lot is going to depend on how many troops decide to remain in various African operations, in Wagner operations, if they're kind of taken over by the Russian military, or linked entities. Russia certainly itself doesn't seem to be in a position to be kind of, if 600 more troops leave from the Central Republic, for example, Russia doesn't really seem to be in a position that it's going to be able to fill those gaps. So I think certainly if we kind of look a bit more short term, this kind of temporary disruption, there is going to be some temporary disruption during this transition. So I think in the CAR already, where we obviously seen these kind of 400, 600 troops leave in the past couple of weeks, there have been kind of reports from local sources and local media there that Wagner bases have been looted because they've just been completely left empty. That some of the rebel groups, the various rebel groups in CAR, the CPC, been the most kind of prominent, have kind of increased their activities in the areas where Wagner was active. So that's kind of this is probably, so yeah, I think that's something we're going to see probably in Central Africa and Mali in particularly. We're going to kind of see these armed groups look to kind of vacate this space that Wagner is leaving. I think I'd say, so before I move to Mali, on the Central African Republic, I think one thing that probably won't lead to a kind of a complete collapse in the security environment there, even if there is this kind of scale down on Wagner, is that there's a heavy Rwandan presence. So I think Rwanda has something like 2,000 to 3,000 troops. And actually Wagner has arguably taken credit for a lot of what the Rwandans have actually done. So the whole kind of defense of Bangui a couple of years ago was primarily done by Rwandan troops, and that was kind of Wagner took the credit for it. So I think there's that level of there's that kind of security blanket there for the regime in the Central Republic. In Mali, it's a slightly different case. There's around 1,000 Wagner fighters there, and since the French withdrew in August last year and took kind of critical aerial assets and intelligence capabilities with them, jihadist groups, Islamic State and Jainim, been the two dominant there, have actually expanded their activities anyway. They've kind of moved down from northern and central regions and are now more active in southern areas, including around the capital, Bamako. So I think again we'll see more of that. Another factor in Mali as well is that there has been in recent weeks announced that it's going to withdraw by the end of this year. So again that will again kind of impact the security environment in the northern territories where MINUSMA was withdrawn, and it's going to allow groups from this area to kind of push further into central and further southern regions. So it was always going to have a challenge there, and it's difficult to say how beyond expansion of armed groups, it's going to be difficult to say how it's going to completely evolve, because Wagner's going to have to, or whoever takes over the Wagner entity there is going to have to seriously scale up its troop deployments to have any sort of discernible impact on kind of counterinsurgency campaigns in Mali.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I have a question for Cyrus now. Is there any future for China's so-called peace plan in the Ukraine conflict now? To the extent that there ever was a future for this.
Okay, so thanks for the question. So at this stage, China's peace plan has not gained any support from major Western power. So we expect that this situation will actually continue in the future, as China's peace plan is actually being described as don't really have any concrete plan to foster communication or post-war construction across the conflict regions. And therefore, if China refuses to adjust its peace plan, I don't see there will be actual negotiation between Ukraine and Russia as well as other Western powers in the coming months. But after the Wagner rebellion, China may gain more ground to discuss with Russia in how to foster the negotiation of peace plan or how to handle the situation following the conflicts. And therefore, if China decides to push to give more pressure to Putin to try to reach an agreement with Moscow to have a more aggressive peace negotiation plan. It may help resolving the ongoing conflicts and try to help inviting other Western powers back to the negotiation table in the future. But we don't expect that it will happen soon. So at this stage, as there will be no major shift on the partnership between China and Russia, I don't expect there will be any actual progress regarding the peace plan in the near stage.
Thank you very much for that. I don't think there was really any real hope behind that to begin with, but good that we're in alignment there. Andrew, there's another question here for you. Aside from security issues, what would you say are the issues businesses be most concerned about when it comes to the Wagner Russia-associated activities in Africa?
I would say the kind of the continuation. This is partly security linked, so I'm going to kind of bend the rules slightly on the question. Obviously, the continuation of kind of disinformation and propaganda campaigns is going to continue to kind of drive this anti-Western kind of pro-Russian sentiment over the next couple of years, and if not longer. And this is going to increase the kind of likelihood that UN missions in CAR or the DRC are going to kind of face growing calls to withdraw, whilst governments that are kind of still Western friendly, such as Chad and Niger, are going to face kind of increasing public pressure to end Western military support. So again, that's going to kind of, obviously, if any of those do happen, then that's obviously going to link into the security environment. Outside of that, probably the one fact that I would say is that if it's looking like the African governments are going to be less keen to partner with Wagner associated entities directly, for kind of out of concern that it could undermine their relationship with Moscow. So it's quite likely that Wagner linked groups are going to start to offer their services else to other actors, including private corporations. So if you kind of look at Wagner's operations in Africa, kind of since it started there in 2017, it's primarily worked with governments in return for payment or natural resource concessions. However, if its corporate structures are going to be reorganized, then governments are not going to be as keen to work with it. So it's quite likely that certain Wagner entities are going to start offering services such as close protection, site security, strategic advice, to high net worth individuals, to companies, or to organizations operating in high risk areas. So obviously this is going to present kind of elevated compliance and reputational issues for companies that Wagner could potentially approach, particularly as more of these Wagner linked groups and individuals are sanctioned by the US and other Western partners. And one thing we've seen this year in the Central Republic as well, which I mentioned earlier, so outside of its kind of services that it provides, it also has links in the alcohol sector, in agriculture, in the media. We've actually seen Wagner personnel carry out attacks on competitors. So the most high-profile one of this, there was an arson attack on a French owned brewery in Bangui in March. And this is a trend that is likely to become more prominent in other sectors and potentially in other countries as the group looks to expand its commercial interests over the coming years. Another thing that kind of Russian linked entities are probably going to continue to do, which Wagner has done quite successfully, particularly in Mali and the Central Republic in recent years, is to kind of convince political leaders and governments there to expropriate licenses and rights already granted to companies, and primarily Western ones when I say that, and award them to Russian companies instead. Likewise, they've also quite successfully used their influence to try and encourage governments to amend legislation that is ever more favourable to the government, so a lot more nationalistic, or is more favourable to Russian companies. And I think we're going to see probably a continuation. We're going to see more a continuation of that as well in certain countries where kind of what is now Wagner and potentially wherever it will be in the months to come will do. So again, as a kind of result of that, you're going to see companies in more sectors starting to face more severe contractual issues, kind of regulatory uncertainty in countries where they operate, and there's kind of also a Russian or a Wagner kind of linked presence.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And one last question that sneaked in under the wire. Tim, are there any private military companies that are in a position to replace Wagner?
Sorry. That's an excellent question. So the proliferation of private military companies has been happening for many years now in Russia. I'm not overly surprised. A lot of places, a lot of people have felt that they've needed to have people for their own personal bodyguards. When it comes to Wagner, essentially what we have here is a group that has been essentially state sponsored, and it has got lots of experience and resources given to it by the state for so many years that it's been allowed to build up expertise in Africa and elsewhere. And what you've got here is as we've seen, is kind of like an alternative military structure. The other kind of private military companies that exist in Russia right now don't even come close to this. We have the Kadyrovtsi, which is the Chechen warlords, Ramzan Kadyrov's group that started kind of like as his little private militia. They do have kind of some heavy weapons, and they certainly have their abilities. They are actually fighting in Ukraine, but they are minuscule in comparison to Wagner, and they are most certainly not in any way, shape, or form as competent as Wagner was or is. We have a Gazprom group. Gazprom has its own little private military company, but when I say little, that kind of like is what it is. There are several other smaller groups. Many of them are fighting in Ukraine, but they do not have the capabilities that Wagner did. So, in the sense of being able to replace Wagner, absolutely not. There's nothing at all that is even close. Will they be able to go out and work in Ukraine under the Russian military? Probably. I would say that is most likely the case. But yeah, I do not think there's anything that can replace Wagner in the entity that it was, at least before the revolt.
On that note, I think it is time that we wrap up our discussion. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Our contact details are up on the screen there. So if you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to email us. Thank you once again for joining us at this Torchlight AI webinar.